My name is Ian Mulhern, and I'm the Executive Director for UK Policy here at the Tony Blair Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to our TBI Talks webinar this morning, and we're talking about the politics of climate change. And it's obviously been a big week for climate politics and policy. Earlier in the week, we heard the UK government announce its commitment to a 78% reduction in emissions by 2035, and yesterday, at the White House's climate summit, other countries announced similarly ambitious intentions. But targets are one thing and action is obviously another. And we've had for many years a big focus on the technical challenge of net zero, but we've had far less focus really on the political one. Decarbonising our economies is a generation-long challenge that will cut across every area of our day-to-day lives, and it will create inevitably political tensions between those who wish that we could go faster and those who are less keen on the changes that they're seeing. And unless we understand how people think about these issues, we risk this agenda running into a backlash, a showdown, if you like, between bunny huggers and petrol heads, and the whole agenda becoming another front in a culture war. And last month, we published a report that aims to open up the debate around these questions, which my colleague Tim will speak to shortly. And we find that climate change views tend to diverge more along the liberal, conservative values spectrum than they do really along the left-right economic one. And that's of particular interest that the need for action comes at a time when British politics has just undergone really a significant realignment, a shift that was both reflected in and exacerbated by the Brexit debate of the past 5 years, with economic issues less salient and values more salient than we've seen typically in the past. So it's in that context that we're here to discuss how can long-term support for the net zero agenda be built and sustained without being undermined by these new dividing lines of British politics. And to do that, we have a fantastic panel of speakers to hear from. We have two of the finest minds in British political science, a veteran of the 2019 general election and someone who's been at the heart of net zero policy making in government for years. So we'll hear from Paula Surridge, who's Deputy Director of UK in a Changing Europe and Senior Lecturer at Bristol University. We'll hear from Professor Robert Ford, who is Professor of Political Science at Manchester University. And we'll hear from Anna Turley, MP for Redcar between 2015 and 2019, who lost her seat to Conservatives and has therefore really been at the front line of that apparent political realignment that I mentioned. But first, I'm going to go to my colleague, Tim Lord. Tim is our Senior Fellow for Net Zero, and he was also until recently the Director of Clean Growth at BEIS, and has therefore had a front row seat in formulating many of these policies over the years. I'll hand over to Tim, who can take us through the findings to get us underway. Tim, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. So, as you say, we published our report a couple of weeks ago on mapping the politics of net zero, and really where it came from was wanting to test some of the preconceptions around climate change. So first of all, that the UK has a stable political consensus on the need for climate action. Because, in 2008, when we passed the Climate Change Act, I think only 6 MPs voted against it. In 2019, every major party had net zero as a core part of its manifesto pledges. But in 2017, net zero wasn't even mentioned in any manifesto, including that of the Green Party. And Anna might remember the debate that we had in 2019 when the net zero legislation was passed. When I was in government at the time, I was sitting in the officials box, and that debate basically involved politicians from all sides of the House saying what a wonderful idea net zero was and how important it was. But there was barely a mention of what it actually meant in practice. The second preconception was that climate change is only a concern for the liberal, the urban, the young, the middle class. And when you look at the coverage around groups like Extinction Rebellion, for example, the coverage of their protest yesterday, you see a lot of that preconception playing out in the media in particular. And the third one was that concern on climate change, it might be high, but it's soft. And as soon as people realize what this actually means in practice, they're going to start opposing it. And obviously the example that we tend to use for that is the Gilets jaunes protests in France around environmental taxes on fuel. So to look at that, we used a range of data sources, so in particular the British Election Survey, and the government's own tracker poll on climate issues. And I should thank my colleague, Brett Mayer, who did all the data for this report and has sort of by accident now become probably one of the world's leading experts on UK climate polling, despite being based on the East Coast of the US. And when we look at that data, the first thing we wanted to look at was, okay, we can all read a poll in any paper saying people are worried about climate change, but how sustained is that over time? And what we found is actually it is sustained over time, that what you'd expect to have happened sort of has happened over the last 10 years. We've seen increasing numbers of people being worried about climate change. But the other really interesting thing here is that what we saw in 2008 after the great financial crisis was a very rapid drop-off in concern about climate change, presumably because people were worried about other things. But what we haven't seen is that happening again with coronavirus. So there's a reasonable, I think, proposition that the concern on climate is much more sustained now than it was 10 years ago. What we then did was we looked under the bonnet of that data, looked at it on a demographic basis. So trying to test this thesis that, it's mainly young urban voters that are worried about this. And what we found here was essentially two things. One was that 10 years ago, that was sort of true. But what we've seen over those 10 years is that the gap has closed and actually concern has risen most among those who were least concerned 10 years ago. So if you look at the age graph in the top left here, you can see a pretty big gap back in 2012, but that's now come down to a very small gap in 2020. And we see that on income, on social grade, and on urban and rural voters as well. So if you're a politician who's worried about climate change, you think, great, everyone's worried about this, I can get on with it. But what we then did was look at the split on values. And there we start seeing some causes for concern. So on a kind of left-right split, so voters being asked questions about their economic views, the split is actually pretty small and certainly not out of whack with what you might expect. But we then looked at it on an open-close basis. So this is a proxy for the liberal authoritarian basis that Paula and others have pioneered in looking at voter behaviour. And what we found there was, you can see on the right of this graph, is a very, very significant split in terms of open voters and closed voters' views on and levels of concern about climate change. And if we compare that, we shouldn't compare everything to Brexit, but we'll compare this to Brexit for now at least. And if we look at it in comparison to the Leave Remain vote back in 2016, you obviously saw a very big vote, a very big split in the vote on a Remain and Leave basis, on an open close basis. And we're seeing a very similar thing, as you can see, on climate change in the top bar here. Not quite as significant a split as yet, but very similar, and certainly probably the key predictor for views on climate change. Then, and I think where this starts to get really interesting and quite stark is look at that in comparison to the main party's voter bases. And the interesting thing here at the bottom of this chart is you can see that the Labour vote, as we know, has shifted very much towards an open voter between 2015 and 2020, whereas the Conservative vote has shifted in the other direction towards closed voters. The other key point here is that those voters who've switched are the key battleground. Well, we always talk about the red wall a lot, but actually nationwide, that's a really important battleground for parties thinking about the next election. And I guess the other point I'd make here, not on this chart, but on the left-hand side of it, on the open side, you have Labour being pulled in that direction, for example, by the Green Party and others advocating for a Green New Deal approach to tackling climate change. And the Conservatives being pulled more in a closed direction by some of their backbenchers and potentially by whatever the successor to kind of UKIP and the Brexit Party might look like. So I think our conclusion really is that the climate consensus is pretty fragile, but I think we're a bit more optimistic in thinking that it doesn't necessarily have to fracture. And very briefly, there's 6 things that I think we've looked at as potential learnings from some of this, and we'll unpack these more in a series of future reports. So the first is around public understanding. Concerns high, but understanding of what people need to do for net zero is pretty low. And I think it's almost certainly fair to say that we can't expect voters to support and participate in this transition if they don't understand why they're being asked to do certain things. The second thing is that the framing matters. So communicating a rationale in a way that makes sense for different voter groups matters a lot. I mean, the bunny hugger stuff yesterday, I think actually in some ways it could be quite an effective messaging to some parts of the electorate who perhaps are up for acting on net zero, but don't want to be associated with people whose values they don't feel they share. Whether it's as effective when talking to a group of global leaders is a separate question entirely, of course. Thirdly, around patriotism and ownership. So how can we make a sense of national mission around net zero? How can we enable local communities to feel empowered and enabled in designing what it looks like for them? Fourth, and I think really crucially, gaining and not losing. So quite often, I think it's fair to say that climate is framed as, you know, essentially about avoiding apocalypse, as opposed to about a positive vision of the future for people and their families and their communities. And I think in particular, articulating that in terms of growth and jobs, and not just on a macroeconomic level, which is perhaps the trap that the Remain campaign fell into, but in a way that is actually meaning for people within their local areas. And then the last point, I think, is about fairness. And quite often when we talk about climate change, we talk about the just transition, which is principally focused on those who are most at risk, perhaps in the very lowest income deciles or the very poorest countries. And clearly that is a hugely important lens for this. But I think in terms of what the data is telling us about the politics, it's that actually the next 5, 6, 7 income deciles matter a lot as well. And if people feel like this is an agenda that, for example, wealthy people who can afford electric vehicles can participate in a way that works for them, but not one that works for the majority of people, then the risk of fracture is very significant. So I'll pause there, but hopefully we can unpack some of that as we move through the session today. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. That's great. Now, Paula, you've done a huge amount of work looking particularly at this kind of values space with respect to Brexit and other things. So I'll hand over to you. Really keen to hear what you have to say about this.
Thank you. So I think one of the key, although attitudes to these issues do connect to that set of values that you talk about as open and closed, I've talked about as liberal authoritarian, other people use other labels for it. Although it is connected to that, as you point out in the slides and in the report, it isn't polarized across that yet. So on your slide there, on both the open and the closed side, you've still got majority support for change and for climate action and so on. So I think it's really important to note that there is a danger of overstating this divide and therefore driving it towards polarization, because you end up giving people a reason to try and push it apart because they see it as being in their political interests. At the moment, it isn't in quite that place. And I think it would be a terrible failure of climate campaigning if it ended up in that place. But how can we avoid ending up in that place is then the big question. And I think the points that you raise there about framing is really, really important. So we know that many of these issues are important to different values groups. People talk about the red wall. I talk about a group of voters who are economically reasonably left-wing, but towards the less liberal end of that value scale. They are the group of voters that were most likely to switch from Labour to the Conservatives in 2019. So and they're quite a big group of voters. So how we can appeal to them and talk to them is a really important question. And I think they're learning some of the lessons from the referendum campaign are really important. So Tim mentioned, you know, that the kind of macroeconomic framing doesn't work very well. These are groups of voters who, when you talk to them in focus groups and workshops, talk about pride, national and local pride. They talk about green spaces. They talk about Keep Britain Tidy campaigns. There are all sorts of hooks there that can be used to talk to groups of voters who are not traditionally seen as being in favour, or it's not that they're not in favour, not seen as change on and environmental action being one of their high priorities. So I think that's really, really important, learning how to connect these issues that we want to have political change on to things that the voters think about in emotional terms. I think the one lesson we surely learned from the referendum campaign is that the best way to get voters to engage is to connect with them emotionally more than anything else. And I think pride in national and local areas is a way of doing that. I think thinking about the environment as part of national heritage is another way of doing that, because again, it connects into that idea of pride and national identity. So I think that's the core for me, is thinking about how we connect with those voters, because ultimately, if we want to reach net zero, we want to make really strong action, it doesn't really matter the motivations people bring to it, as long as you can bring them along on the ride. And so in that sense, understanding what you can say to these voters, what will connect with them, is the really, really core point.
Thanks, Paula, that's great. I wondered if you could, Tim mentioned the HSBC protests yesterday. I wonder if you could comment on that. I mean, as you mentioned, one of the dangers here is of making these dividing lines very salient. And looking at that, it sort of feels like the danger is that that kind of thing makes people feel like they need to pick a side, and that's the root of a lot of these problems. I don't know. What's your take on that? How do you what do you think the risks are of that kind of thing, or is it helpful?
I think there are risks of that sort of thing. Politicizing issues in a way that's unhelpful, because many of these voters are very keen on rules and following rules and behaving in a lawful way. So actually, these kinds of very high profile protests actually can work against being able to communicate effectively with those voters. But I think it's also the case, as it was for a really long time around Brexit, and actually seems to be moving back in that direction, that you've got, on lots of these issues, you've got really politicized ends at either end, but they're a minority at either end. There's lots of people in the middle that you can talk to. And I think that's the message to take away, is that on lots of these issues that people try to frame around culture wars, you've just got quite small, very shouty parts of the population at either end that you can almost afford to ignore and focus your messaging on the much larger group of voters who may be concerned about the environment, but also concerned about their job or other factors like that. And you can talk to that middle ground. I've said it lots of times that I think one of our most urgent political problems is learning what the centre ground is on that second dimension and how to talk about it and to the voters in it.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, so I mean, all of these individual views obviously aggregate up to a party political alignment. Rob, that's I guess the point where you come in. Do you want to take us on from there?
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about how what Paul is looking for can go wrong, and how the shouty people can potentially end up making the running, and how the party system can play a role in that I think is something that we need to anticipate and think about. So I'm quite struck how many aspects of the kind of current politics of climate change are quite analogous on the other side of the second dimension spectrum to what the politics of immigration looked like in the 2000s. So you've got an issue that very intensely mobilizes one side of this divide, and in particular a quite sort of passionate minority on one side of this divide, but the other side of this divide is broadly indifferent to the issue and not particularly paying a lot of attention to it. And I think that kind of asymmetry in attention, in salience, in polarization can have some quite important political effects. So UKIP was able to drive the conversation on immigration to the right because voters who cared very strongly about immigration control really didn't want to talk about anything else. And they were a substantial minority. They were a minority, but they were a substantial enough minority, particularly within the Conservative Party and within the Conservative Party activist base, that kind of pressed the Conservative Party into ever more sort of polarized positions on that issue and sort of set the conversation. And I think with climate change, the potential is there for that as well. I don't think that the overall distribution of attitudes is polarized, but I think the risk is that the distribution of salience becomes polarized, so that for your younger, very liberal voters, there comes the all-consuming issue. This is what they want to talk about in politics. This is what they want to see politicians address. And because they are so focused on that, that gives them a kind of disproportionate ability to pull politics in that direction, particularly if you have an issue where that kind of salience and passion is overrepresentative amongst party activists, which I think in the Labour Party is most likely true. And the final element that I think there's a parallel is, if you get a party that mobilizes on one pole of this, then the threat of competition from that party will tend to pull the political spectrum apart. So, UKIP pulled the Conservative rightwards on immigration and on Europe because they were worried about losing activists to UKIP, losing voters to UKIP. The same thing, I've noticed the Green Party are now polling higher than they've polled at any point, I think since the sort of mid-late 2000s, just before the financial crisis. It's not getting much attention yet, but it's 6%, 7%, 8%. And at a certain point, this starts to become alarming to the parties and they respond to it. The Greens seem to be moving in a similar direction. If Labour start to think we face a significant threat of competition from the Greens for voters and seats, that will tend to pull them into a Green Party narrative about climate change, which has some advantages with some groups in the electorate, but as Paula points out, is possibly not the kind of framing and discussion that you want if you want a sort of big tent coalition on climate change. So I think there's a need to think about how this will play out within parties and party competition if you want to ensure that we get to the centre ground on this, because there's a risk that we end up with a conversation that's driven very much by those who are most passionate on this issue. And, you know, it's good that people are passionate on these issues, but you've got to be able to talk to people who aren't as well.
Thanks, Rob. One of the things that your comments make me wonder about is that it also seems like this issue, there are two potential ends at which you can the main parties could worry about being outflanked, on the Greens on the kind of left open end, and the you know, a revamped Brexit party potentially on the right, or the more authoritarian side. So does that make you think that, is this more worrying than those other examples, because there's kind of potential of being outflanked on both of the poles in a way that perhaps with these other examples that there was only one side that we had to worry about or think about?
Yeah, that's true. Potentially one could see mobilisation on the other pole as well. And I'm a little bit conflicted about how that would play out, because on the one hand, it's really clear that where the passion is on the climate issue, the passion is on the sort of liberal left side. They really care about it in a similar way to how the authoritarian right really cared about immigration. But on the other hand, there's another asymmetry in all this, which is that the kind of authoritarian right groups tends to be, all else being equal, groups who'll turn out more and are more evenly distributed geographically. So they're more of a kind of standing electoral threat, whereas our liberal left voters often don't vote in the numbers. I always tell my students, you know, if you guys voted in the numbers your grandparents did, politics would look rather different. So although there might be a lot of passion in the streets, there may not be so much passion arriving at the ballot box. So even if the right-hand side was less intensely mobilised about this, even a modest mobilisation on this, particularly given how hypersensitive the Conservative Party are to that right flank, could produce a situation where, you know, on both sides of the spectrum, you're seeing the running getting made by the extremes. I think there is a risk of that, yeah.
Great. Okay, let's go, Anna, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. And yeah, it's lovely to be here. I'm sat in really what is the heart of a Redwall area here in Redcar, and obviously it's alongside Middlesbrough. It's on the banks of the River Tees. It's part of the beating heart of Teesside and the history here with the industry. And it's, in a way, it should be the sort of place where, if you really wanted to, you know, it's a 67% leave voting seat. If you wanted to say this is where, you know, this is the sort of testing ground, will people here respect and accept a sort of green agenda and want to buy into it? I think this is the sort of perfect place to be. It's no coincidence that people from Middlesbrough are called smoggies, because, you know, the history of the industry here was such that the pollution, the smog was overwhelming, and that became their nickname. So, you know, this is really a sort of, you know, what should be the beating heart of you know, where green issues are tested, and potentially, as I'll go on to talk about a bit in a minute, is where the future, I think, of green industries lay. So I wanted to just talk a bit about being in a kind of Redwall area, Redwall seat, and what the sort of perceptions I've felt from 9 years of door knocking every weekend and often every day in patches to get people's response. And I think, you know, Redcar is like a lot of so-called, you know, Redwall areas around the country. Historically, perhaps has traditionally voted Labour, but those bonds are fraying. They're in former heavy industrial areas with strong histories and heritage, coal, here particularly steel, manufacturing. And people that I speak to here left school at 16, many of them 30, 40 years ago, and would have a job for life. They knew that they could go and work in the steelworks, go and work at ICI, and there was that security, and it was part of the identity. People knew their parents, their grandparents had worked at the steelworks, that the industry there had built the world. The steel from Redcar had built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Canary Wharf, very, very strongly part of the local identity, and that industry was really at the heart of it. Demographically here, we see a lot of older voters, young people, if they do get professional skills and qualifications, tend to move away for work. So young people that here are left are often those that are most excluded and left behind, and those that can afford to live here with often with pensions from secure jobs in steel and ICI mean the demographics are generally older. And I think geography plays a big part in many of the areas like this that often feel quite isolated. You know, Redcar's on the end of a line, it, you know, meets the North Sea. These are areas that are towns, rather don't necessarily have big metropolitan areas, often feel isolated, may have lost trains over the years, are heavily dependent on cars, with poor public transport, which is an issue that we know we can come to talk on about a bit more later. And, you know, as we've seen, tend to be more socially conservative, quite economically left wing, but socially conservative, less liberal, and so on. And I think how people see themselves here is actually just as powerful as the demographics that we've talked about. People here are very proud of their history. They're very clear and conscious of that. They know that the iron ore was found in those hills. And as I say, the steel here built the world. They're defiant. They know they work hard. They feel overlooked. They feel taken for granted. They feel, particularly lately in the last few years, looked down on and sneered at. And Brexit drove a real sort of wedge through that in the way that it was exploited. And they feel a very strong north-south divide. I mean, a quick anecdote, I saw a quote from someone, Vox popped at the Hartlepool by-election yesterday, who said, yeah, we want a local MP, we don't want one that's going sloping off down to London all the time. And I think that just says something about the sort of disconnect people feel, that, you know, Parliament's in Westminster, but the idea that an MP would go down to London all the time is seen as a sort of sense of neglect. And that sort of disconnect in politics, I think, is very powerful when we talk about a lot of the issues that we're talking about today. But on the green agenda, I do think it would be very easy to say, oh, people here, you know, won't like bunny huggers, to use Boris Johnson. You know, I think that would be the sort of audience that he would think would be key to that sort of quote. But actually, I'm not sure that that's the case. In 9 years, I've never once heard someone raise an objection on a doorstep to issues of climate change or to complain about it. I think people of all generations here understand its importance. And I think people like David Attenborough played a big role in that generational divide as well. But particularly amongst young people, it is very strong. I used to talk to schools every Friday morning, and every single time without fail, climate change would be raised as an issue by the young people here. Many of them were doing projects on issues like plastics in the sea and so on. And as I say, you know, this is an area that has been heavily polluting. The River Tees was lined with steel plants, coke ovens. You'd think that, you know, that it would not be a priority for people. But I think it all comes down to sort of prioritization. People's struggles here are about jobs. People's struggles here are about secure, well-paid jobs for their children, for education, for getting food on the table, being able to have a holiday, being able to, you know, live well. Those are the battles that people face. And I think everything else kind of comes secondary to that. And I think where things are changing on Teesside is that actually, because where we lost the steelworks, you know, a major blow to the economy, 2,300 people lost their jobs overnight, massive blow. The average salary here decreased by £10,000 a year, big ripple out effect on the local economy. But the benefit of, if there is any of that, is that we do have a major industrial site, which is shifting to be part of a new green industrial base. And that's being framed, going back to the points that Tim and Paul have both made about local identity, about ownership, and about a sort of patriotism and a local patriotism. I think Teessiders are now starting to embrace the idea that where they first drove the first industrial revolution, they now could be at the heart of a new green industrial revolution. So I think people are really proud that we're starting to see on the regeneration of the steel site now, carbon capture and storage. We're going to be the UK's first zero carbon industrial cluster. 20% of the UK's hydrogen is going to be made here, and they're experimenting with hydrogen transport. There's a huge wind turbine plant being built here. These new green technologies are going to provide jobs for people in construction and the kind of, you know, engineering, the sectors that we've traditionally had a very strong base in. And, you know, there may be a bit of a sort of time lapse in that, but we are going to hopefully have, you know, the jobs and the industries of the future and be at the beating heart of this new green industry in the way that we were, you know, 200 years ago. And I think that's very powerful for people here in terms of identity and a new modern identity for Teesside. But I think where we will have more struggles and more difficulties will be around issues of sort of behavioural change, and where there may, you know, other big industrial kind of projects are great, but asking people to change their behaviour, you know, is going to be more challenging. And I've been doing some other work with polling organisations around other issues on leisure and betting, but I thought this had betting and gambling, but this had an interesting read across, because there was a quote from somebody about this sense of being told what to do, incursions into their personal liberty. And he said about betting, he said, it's a cultural thing here. I like betting. It's part of my week. I work hard all week. And at the end of the week, yeah, I might spend more than I should on drinking and betting, but so what? It's my money. I've paid my taxes on it. And this bit's critical. He says, they don't understand us. They think we should all be cycling or whatever instead. And I think this sense of them and us that feeds into all the sort of Brexit stuff, north, south, politicians being out of touch, very, very powerful if politicians are going to start telling people, you know, what to do and how to spend their lives. And I think particularly post-COVID, some of this is coming through really strongly. People have accepted a lot of incursion into their lives. What they don't want to see is a sort of mission creep. They want their lives back, but they're very proud and increasingly aware of their freedoms. They wouldn't necessarily use the word civil liberties, but you know, they want to have control of their lives, and they don't want politicians down in London, in that, you know, as we've heard, that far away, telling them what to do. So I think this is where the government may come up against some opposition if they try to dictate around diet or lifestyle. And as I mentioned, driving is a very, very powerful one here. Everybody has. You know, one of the biggest issues raised with me on the doorsteps was parking out the front of people's houses, because everything was designed pre-cars. Everyone here now has two, sometimes three cars if their children are still living at home. Everybody drives. Public transport is very, very poor. And the same when it comes to things that might cost money. So the shift to electric cars, or changing your home heating system, whether that's to hydrogen or anything else, or restrictions on your one holiday a year, flying to your one holiday a year that you've worked really hard for. I think these will all be difficult issues to challenge, particularly if they're costly. And we're talking about people here who are really, you know, on insecure work, often trying and struggling to get by. So in summary, I think, you know, the PM with his bunny hugging views was probably trying to reach people in areas like Redcar, but I think he's actually a bit of a way behind where they are. They may not like Extinction Rebellion. They may not want to listen to Greta Thunberg. That may be a bit too radical and extreme to them, but they do listen to David Attenborough, and they do generally get it, and they do want a better world for their children, as long as that's balanced with good, secure jobs, a good income, and the ability to live a happy and prosperous life. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Anna, I wonder if we could, there's a few questions coming up on this, but one specifically, I guess, would be interested to hear your views on is, with the new targets that were announced earlier this week, Tim's written a great blog on our site about what the implications of that are. And, you know, for example, the implications for kind of meat consumption and things like that are quite stark. And I just wonder, if you were standing in Redcar again, like, how comfortable would you feel going into that kind of election with a policy agenda that involves some kind of interventions in people's lives that might involve cutting back on meat? How do you square this circle, do you think?
I think it would be really tricky, and I think there'd definitely be an age demographic here. You know, I know a lot of people in this area who are vegan and who are, you know, very environmentally minded, but I also know that some of the people whose doors I've knocked on, if I tried to tell them to only eat meat once a week, would, you know, tell me in pretty clear language where to go. So I think it would be a massive challenge, and I think it's, you know, as we've talked about earlier, it really is about how you communicate with people, the alternatives that you can get, the affordability, but also I think if it's done to people as a, you know, seen as a restriction on their lifestyle, or yet again another thing being told what to do by people who don't understand how hard I work. I mean, there's another quote from the researcher around gambling, was a guy who said, look, I work myself to the bone all week, I'm exhausted, but when I get home I've still got to build the patio and do the DIY because I can't afford to get somebody in to do that. They don't understand that. MPs just pay for someone. They don't understand how hard I work, and therefore how I want to live the way I want to live. And I just think, you know, if they think some kind of liberal MP who doesn't do a patio, doesn't, you know, do their DIY or fix a patio, is telling them to cycle more and eat less meat, you know, it's just not going to work. It's got to be about, you know, how we communicate this, the incentives that we offer people, and doing it with them, making them part of the solution. Because if it becomes a culture war, you know, as we've discussed, if it becomes another polarized issue, then it's going to spectacularly backfire. So it will be very much about doing things with people in a way that won't, you know, feel threatening to them.
Great. Okay, let's open it up to questions. I've got a few here along that sort of theme, which I guess is really at the core of what we're talking about. If I go first to Carla Adam has a question: what does the panel make of Boris Johnson's bunny hugger comments? And secondly, how can policymakers sustain public support when changes really start to hit home? For example, no diesel cars, no gas hubs, new boilers, etc. So I guess that's a broader read on that question about the practical measures. And then a related one, David Brito has a question. David, if I come to you about civil liberties, do you want to ask your question?
Hi everyone, my question is about civil liberties. So how should politicians respond to the arguments that people shouldn't be forced to make changes to their lifestyle or to where they live, et cetera, to combat climate change? Curious to hear people's thoughts on that.
So I guess if we take those two together and maybe go in panel order, Paul, did you want to start off with any thoughts on that set?
So I think this is something where we have to tread really carefully, because it is where you could lose people really easily. But we can also learn lessons from the amount of restrictions on civil liberties people have been actually really quite enthusiastic about through the last year, when they knew what it was for, what it was protecting and why it was protecting it. So if we just tell people you must cycle, you can't have a diesel car, you mustn't eat meat, you're going to get a lot of pushback. But this time a year ago, if we just said to people, you've got to stay home, you'd have got a lot of pushback too. It's only because of the way it's then framed that it gets support and it draws people in. So I think it goes back to that issue of framing and taking people with you on this journey rather than trying to impose from above. I would also say, though, that a lot of people in the kind of groups we're talking about, there's far more enthusiasm for business paying for these things rather than individuals paying for these things. So, and that's where we get into it being about the kind of dual location in their values. So it's where the left-wingness interacts with their kind of rule-based, closed in your language position, because actually they see that they feel that big businesses should be the ones that are making the most changes and paying more tax to deal with these things. So they mostly want to see action taken at that level first, and then I think you can start to take them along a little bit on that journey.
Okay, Rob, do you want to throw anything in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take the how do we bring people along point first, and then I want to just say something about Johnson's comments and what I think the politics of those might be. So in terms of bringing people along on the policy, I've got two thoughts on this. The first is I think anything that front loads the benefits to people rather than the costs to people is going to be a much easier sell. And there are so many things that we can do to sort of, push things along with climate change, that there are quite a number of things we could potentially front load in terms of benefits, in terms of, rather than you're going to need to pay X for this, or you're going to need to get rid of your car and buy a new one. I mean, I remember back in the financial crisis, there was the cash for clunkers scheme. I think the Americans had a particularly big one because some of the researchers had found that something like 5% of the cars out there produced 90% of the particulate pollution. So they said, well, let's just buy them all up. These tend to be people who are poorer. That's why they're running such old cars. Things like that, where you can say to people, hey, guess what? You get a benefit out of this. And then similarly at a community level, hey, guess what? Your community gets a benefit out of this, rather than, hey, guess what? Here's a thing you can't do, or hey, guess what? Here's a bill you got to pay. I think that's a better framing. And then in terms of the politics of this, Johnson is a very effective politician when it comes to punching bruises. And the fact that he's talking like that suggests to me that he thinks there's a bruise to punch there. And I think he may well have a point in that what he's probably recognized is what I was kind of alluding to earlier, that the people who are most passionate and vocal on this issue often don't want to adopt that kind of win-win, everybody gains framing. They actually do want to adopt a slightly moralizing hair shirt framing. And if you're the Conservative Party, it's the hair shirts the moralizers that you want to have the argument with. You don't want to have the argument with the people in the centre ground. It's much more politically beneficial for you to be talking to and about bunny huggers. And that is not, I suspect, a political temptation given the current government that we can simply wish away. There needs to be a way of addressing that. And the most difficult bit of addressing it is going to be that the moralizers, the bunny huggers themselves, are going to be very, very eager to have that argument with people like Boris Johnson. So how do you direct their enthusiasm in a way that doesn't end up being destructive for their cause?
That's great. Anna, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think the financial incentives point that's been made is absolutely right. I just think that will be the most critical thing to incentivize people into behavior. I mean, I would never have imagined that the plastic bags charge would have had such a dramatic effect. It was way more successful than I, thought it would be. And it does show even just a small amount, 5p can totally shift behavior. And so I think, that is going to be really critical when you're looking at policy levers. Small incentives for individuals, but also, as Paula said, big incentives for businesses or charges on business, I think will be really important. And I think, there is something in terms of what we've seen in COVID. I'd like to think, I may be being naive, but that there is something more around the kind of common good and the way that people can, when it's communicated effectively, think about how we protect each other, how we protect, as was then the NHS, and now, could be the environment for one another. Can this be a bit of a sort of sense of rebuilding of the collective good? I'm not sure, given Robert's comments, that that's necessarily going to be driven by the people that we have in charge at the moment, but I certainly think that could be a very powerful tool if we actually, worked on that. But I think also critical is going to be about who the messenger is, because I just don't think, say, particularly from my personal experience, from the sort of polling and stuff that I've seen, politicians are not going to be the ones to do this, and the voices that people are going to listen to. I just think they're going to be feel moralized, talked down to. It's going to have to be a lot of other people in a lot of other sectors, again, whether that's kind of business. And I've been quite impressed by some of the kind of global brands now recognizing that through consumer power and so on, they're going to have to show a lot more leadership on different issues, whether that's Black Lives Matters or the environment. And I think there's a big role to play in kind of some of these big brands to help drive and push this agenda. Influencers on social media, celebs, I hate to say it, but I think these are going to be just as powerful voices. Really, as if politicians start to come across as moralizing and telling people what to do, I think it's going to be very difficult. And perhaps that is some of what, I don't know whether he's thinking on that deep level, Boris Johnson's comments, but maybe that's it. It's trying to say, I'm not a moralizer, I'm not telling you what to do. We've just all got to kind of get on and do this. But I do, like Robert, I do despair at the way, what I see locally is a real sort of, since Brexit, there's a desire to continue to mine that seam of division. And I see a lot of the kind of cultural wars constantly being fed, whether that's about statues, Union Jacks, Black Lives Matter, and so on. And I worry that this will be the next sort of attractive seam to mine in terms of, division and turning people against each other and finding somebody to be the enemy, the bad guy, people you want to rage against. So I'd be very depressed if that was the motivation behind it. I think we've got to move on from the sort of disunity that we've had in this country over the last few years and try and get onto a more positive collective agenda. But I guess that's my politics and values, which may be slightly different to those in charge.
Tim, did you want to come in on this, or should we go for another round?
Yeah, just really briefly, because I think there's a really interesting thing about the bunny huggers comment. There was also an interesting piece with Kwasi Kwarteng earlier in the week where he was talking about decarbonisation. He got asked a question about veganism, and he basically said, yeah, veganism is lower carbon impact, and that was written up as have to become vegan to save the planet. And I think that one of the risks is that without a really clear communication of what net zero actually means, that there's a risk that it starts looking binary, because we don't need everyone to become vegan to get to net zero at all. We probably want them to eat a little bit less meat, but at the moment, because there isn't a kind of clear plan about where we're trying to get to, there's a risk that you kind of lump a load of behaviours in a box which doesn't look necessarily attractive to most voters, and that's what net zero looks like. And I think the clearer that we can be, that the government can be about what the strategy looks like, the better. And then I agree with Anna that then the communication of that should not just be the government. It needs to be companies, it needs to be wider influencers, across society doing a lot of that. But you do need to have a vision about where you're trying to get to and what that world actually looks like in order to enable that.
Okay, great. Let's go for another round. There's a question here from Martin Yui, which I think follows quite neatly on from what you were just saying there, Tim, about the extent to which politicians need to be honest about this. So your question here in the box is about rather than projecting this all as sunlit uplands of creating a green society, does the panel think there's also a need for honesty from politicians? That, you know, it means trashing North Sea industry and that sort of thing. So there's a question there, and I guess sort of perhaps there's also a riff on that which we might talk about, which is like not necessarily about politicians' honesty or not honest or not being honest, because I don't think anyone wants politicians to be lying, but there is a question about what they emphasize and what they don't emphasize, which is perhaps part of that debate as well. Second, there's a couple of questions here, one from Jiga and one from Robin. Maybe I'll ask Robin to voice this question about the role of localism here, particularly following on from what Anna said. Robin, can you hear us?
My question was really trying to tease out the extent to which the centralization of so many of these decisions is being made, centralizations of power and resources, whereas if we had much more of these decisions being made locally, which means, of course, pushing both power and resources out locally, people would feel that their context and their particular combination of problems was being better recognized.
Great. Thank you. And then finally, I might come to David, who's got a question. We've been talking a lot about the values space, and David's question is really back on the economics, which does still matter. David, do you want to ask your question?
We've seen problems in France with the Gilets jaunes process when taxes were raised. Could these problems be avoided by policies regarding the redistribution of the revenues, so that people will say, yes, this money has been raised for taxes on bad things and it's now funding things that are clearly helping us all to adjust to the new possibilities?
Okay, fantastic. So we've got one there on politicians' approaches and the extent of honesty in this debate, one on localism and one on redistribution and sort of just transition issues. Let's go in reverse through the panel on that. Anna, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks. Honesty in politics. Can we have a whole separate seminar on this? I'm probably the worst person to ask about this because I try to be honest about the implications of Brexit, about all sorts of things, and I'm not sure it particularly worked for me. But you know, I think I'm a massive believer that politicians have got to start leveling with people about the reality. I think, you know, so I can go on a rant about this, but I think we are in a strange world at the moment where politics is able to gaslight, lie, dissemble, and create an image of, you know, economic trade-offs and political decisions that I just don't think are being honest and straight with the public, and I find that very disheartening. So sorry, that is probably as good enough. I just wish we had more moral backbone and bravery in politics today. Sadly, I just don't think there's enough. So on Robin's question on centralisation, localism, I think that's really, really important. I generally don't think that we would have had the transition that we've got in Redcar if that hadn't been locally driven. It pains me to say it because it's a Conservative mayor at the heart of it, but you know, we are, and I'd like to think a Labour politician would have done the same with the same money. But the reality is, I don't, when the steelworks was shut by central government, I don't think they had a clue about what the site meant. I don't think they had a clue about what the jobs meant to local people. I don't think they had a clue about the industry. And it took, you know, local leadership, local businesses, you know, local partnerships here, not only to deal with the repercussions of that decision, but also to deal with the regeneration in the building. Yes, we needed central government to, you know, help support the big infrastructure bids and, you know, some investment. Sorry about my dog. But it absolutely wouldn't have happened without local vision and local understanding of, you know, what the strengths in the workforce and in the industrial infrastructure were to facilitate that. So I completely agree. but it needed central central government support as well. And finally, on David's point, I absolutely agree about the clarity of where the money was coming from. I remember the windfall taxes on I think it was on utility companies sort of around 97. Others at the Tony Blair Institute would know better than me, but very clearly sent to the NHS, and there was public consensus for that. In the same way with the the plastic bags, that was very clearly sent to local causes. And I think when people can see that return, there's definitely a better incentive than just thinking it's just going into a big pot with the Treasury where politicians I don't know or don't understand my life are making decisions about how to spend that money. So I think that's really critical to the communication around this.
Okay, fantastic. Rob, do you want to pick up on any of those?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a kind of general the devil is in the detail response to all of these things in a sense. On honesty in politics, I think voters always say they want that more than their behaviour actually ever suggests they are willing to incentivise it. If they want it, they should reward it. And if it's honesty about negative things, I can't think of many examples of them rewarding that kind of honesty. But that said, there are ways of being honest while framing the narrative in a positive way, and there are ways of being honest while framing the narrative in a negative way. If you say all of you who work in the oil industry are going to lose your jobs, full stop, that's honest, but it's not a very politically appealing message for any party. If you say to people, this is going to be difficult and we're all going to have to pull together, but at the end there'll also be lots of opportunities for many of you because this transformation brings new things in as well as phasing old things out, that's different. It's actually being honest about the same set of outcomes, but in a way that emphasizes the positive elements of change rather than the negative elements of change. And to come back to what I was saying before, I do think there is an element of the sort of hair shirt side of this that wants to be brutally honest because they see that as making the moral case for the scale of change needed. And I just don't think that works in the centre ground politically. So I think that kind of honesty risks doing more harm than good. You need an honesty that is positively framed. And then on the points about local control of both funding and spending, I think yes, all else being equal, people really like that and it helps to legitimate things. But if I may use one of British politics' favourite acronyms, there is a risk always with local control on some things, which is the risk of the mighty NIMBY. I mean, how many of the huge numbers of wind turbines that we've managed to get built in this country, which have done a huge amount to shift the carbon emissions of our electricity producing system, would have been built if local people had had a veto over building them. Being somewhat cynical and having grown up in a sort of NIMBY hot zone, my suspicion is not very many. So I think there will be some big macro investment decisions that can't really be devolved locally because you'll end up with the very asymmetric local politics of planning, which is always, yes, I think it's a good idea, but just not where I live. On the other hand, when it comes to green funds and spending those green funds, I think local control is absolutely the best way to do that to help legitimate things. So, it's again, like different horses for different courses, I think, a little bit.
Okay, fantastic. Paula, do you want to come in on any of that?
Just really briefly on, I think mainly on the final point about the economics of it. And I think, again, just to stress, this is where we have to understand that voters have views on more than one dimension and that matters for these things. Even if your views don't necessarily predict your position overall, they predict how you respond to particular things around taxation, for example. And I think that, again, it goes back to the messaging and the framing. The redistribution framing is really strong, but there's also a sense that some of the things that are proposed fall more heavily on some groups than others. So we know, for example, about the percentage of flights taken by long haul flights by kind of the top 10%. If you put a tax on those long haul flights, the person, I think it was Anna mentioning that their kind of one holiday a year that they've worked really hard for becomes more expensive, whilst all the business people flying backwards and forwards just gets eaten into their expense account. So I think some of this economic politics of some of these changes is really important for getting messages across in terms of who pays, who can afford to pay, and how that becomes either a personal cost or a business cost. I think needs to be remembered that people have, I always try to get across the argument that people have economic values as well as this kind of open closed dimension, and that those two things come together in ways that we don't really always understand very well.
Tim, in the report, you have a conclusion about the kind of role of the economics in this. Do you have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think just picking up on what some others have said. I mean, first of all, I think clearly the way that the economics of this is designed matters hugely, and it's probably necessary but not sufficient that that's done in a way that is fair and is perceived to be fair. But the other thing I'd say about the kind of politics of the economics of it and the regulation of it is long-term planning horizons help a lot. If we kind of turn up and say, sorry, everyone has to get a heat pump instead of a boiler in 5 years, then you are in the space of kind of people having to rip out boilers when they weren't due to change it. And that, the politics of that are just impossible. Whereas where you've had success, not just on climate but on other things, is where you've had the length of regulation that enables supply chains to build and enables, when something is actually banned, it's kind of part of the furniture that it was on the way out anyway. And I think when we talk about the kind of honesty of politicians, I think it's about being honest actually kind of to themselves as much as it is to the voter, that these are the kinds of changes we're going to need. So how do we plan for that on a sufficiently long time horizon? Because I think the same argument applies actually to the oil and gas sector. The stuff that the government published yesterday said we're going to be using about 20% of the amount of fossil fuels in 2050 that we're using now. So whatever you communicate publicly, you've got to be planning for that. And if you do plan for it, you potentially can do some of the things like happening in Redcar to compensate for that and transfer the skills and the jobs and so on, rather than losing them. And I think in some ways that internal honesty with oneself as a politician is almost as important in this transition as how they approach that question with the voter.
That's great. There's a very big job of pitch rolling to be done, whatever policies we choose. Okay, we're nearly out of time. I just want to come back to our three guests with one final question related to one of the many questions in the box, which have been very good. I'm sorry we couldn't come to all of you, but I guess one of the questions is about, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is this issue to end up getting dragged into the culture war? Now, obviously, that is a very hard thing to put a number on, but I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts on the scale of this risk. Are we just looking at the last war, as it were, and worrying about that too much, or is this a real issue? And secondly, if there's one bit of advice that you would have for either the people framing policies or the politicians involved in this to prevent that happening, what would it be? And I'll go, Paula, to you first, if I may, and end with Anna.
I think I'll start with the second question first. And to prevent that happening, learn the lessons of the referendum and don't talk down to people, because that will alienate them more quickly than anything else. I don't think it's inevitable that this becomes part of a broader culture war. I think we are in a place where it doesn't have to become like that, but it may, because it may be in someone's political interest to drive that. But I don't think from the point of view of voters that it needs to become like that. I think this is an issue that there is widespread support for change. There is widespread acceptance that climate change is real and driven by human behavior. And therefore we can build on that commonality. I mean, in some senses, it's almost as high as support for the NHS. I mean, you're talking about 75% of people agreeing with that statement across all values groups. I ran the figures last night for red wall constituencies. It's 79% in red wall constituencies agree with that statement. It isn't a divisive issue unless we allow somebody to make it one. And that's why I'm a little bit optimistic.
I think Rob is frozen, so I might come to, oh no. Yeah. Rob, how about I come to you next?
Okay, I mean, I think on the question of, is there, how 0 to 10, how likely is this to become a culture war issue? I'd probably score myself in the middle of the scale, because on the one hand, Paul is entirely right that this is much more of a consensus issue in principle than some of the issues that we have seen culture wars waged on. But on the other hand, we're already seeing the Conservatives trying to pull these kinds of levers in this territory, and I fear they'll continue. And B, there's the kind of standing risk that's the legacy of the EU referendum, which is that you have these partisan social identities of Remain and Leave that have become very powerful in voters' minds. And there's a danger that they're like vortexes. Things can get sucked into them. And if they get sucked into them, then people see an issue inescapably through that lens. You know, my tribe says this is a good thing, my enemies say this is a bad thing, or vice versa. That's what needs to be avoided. And therefore, in terms of advice, I'd say the single most important advice is avoid the siren voices of polarization. Don't respond to the provocation of people like Boris saying bunny hugger, but also don't respond to the loudest voices on the radical end on the other side. You know, don't allow those loud polarizing voices to dictate the conversation, because then you can keep that consensus, which, as Paula points, is the biggest asset on this issue.
Fantastic. And Anna, last word to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think people will find it hard to resist. I mean, I think about, you know, Conservative MPs in red wall areas who know that they got their votes lent to them on the basis of, you know, what they saw as Labour failing to stand up for people, Corbyn, Brexit, etc. So I've seen over the last, you know, year attempts, as I said, to mine this seam, whether it's saying that people are coming for statues of Captain Cook, wearing kind of big flag masks and so on, you know, lots of attacks on Black Lives Matter. This stuff is being propagated. But I do agree with Paul that I think they would it would backfire to take on the issue. I think what they're more likely to try and play divide and rule on is around people. So it will be on the sort of, you know, Extension Rebellion. It will be on, you know, what they'll see as sort of crusties. That will be the sort of target. But I think the issue is, and when that's where we've got to keep it above and beyond all that, it's got to be kept mainstream. It's got to be kept something that they can't afford to be on the wrong side of that argument. And that's up to, I think, all of us to do, really.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. We're out of time, a little bit over time, but thank you for sticking with us. I think it's been a really rich conversation, and it's certainly helped our thinking as we do more on this. It's going to be a major sort of area of focus for TBI, and so do look out for further work, because I think if there's one way that we can help, it's by trying to frame policies and develop policy ideas that are conscious of the risks of this becoming a polarized issue. Do look out for further events that will be going up on our site over the coming weeks. But what remains for me to do today is to say thank you to Paula, Rob, and Anna, and Tim, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.